I welcome everybody to my today's discussion on Romanticism. A very common question is asked by the readers of Romanticism. Who is romantic? The answer to this question is not easy to give because Romanticism is involved in a lot of things, a lot of issues that are to be very intensively discussed. Now, the question, who is romantic? To answer to this question, I like to quote from an eminent critic who has said, one poet is romantic because he falls in love. Another romantic because he hears a cuckoo. Another romantic because he sees a ghost. And another romantic because he is reconciled to the church. So now if we think of this very particular assertion of this eminent critic, then we find that Romanticism has got several dimensions. If a poet falls in love, he is romantic. And if he hears a cuckoo, that is the song of cuckoo, then he is romantic. If he can see a ghost, he is also romantic. And if he goes to the church and tries to reconcile himself with God, this is also a very crucial characteristic of Romanticism, or a person with Romanticism. Now, actually, what is Romanticism? C.H. Harford defines Romanticism as an extraordinary development of imaginative sensibility. That is, without imagination, you may have anything else except Romanticism. So imagination is the nucleus. It is the most important thing to be romantic. If anybody wants to be romantic, or if anybody claims to be romantic, he must be imaginative. So imagination is the first and foremost condition to be romantic. Then another person, Walter Pater, has defined Romanticism as addition of strangeness to beauty. That is, love for beauty, or aestheticism, or aesthetics, is a very important portion of Romanticism. If anybody wants to be romantic, he should have love for beauty. Now, what is beauty? It is very, very difficult to define beauty because the conception of beauty is a relative matter. It is defined from different perspectives. Even the ugliest thing has got its beauty. For example, the horror movies of Hollywood are very, very popular worldwide. So why? Why do people love horror movies? Does the ghost have its beauty? Yes, in our real life, we are afraid of ghosts. But while we find the imitation of ghost on the screen, we enjoy it. So probably the viewers discover beauty in the ghost. Otherwise, why should we like the ghost on the screen? So even the ugliest thing, by virtue of the imitation, poetic imitation of the poet, of the artist, becomes beautiful. And this is a very, very crucial capacity of a romantic poet to make an ugly thing beautiful by virtue of his poetic faculty. So the poet who has got this faculty is romantic. Then another writer, Watts Danton, has defined Romanticism as the Renaissance of wonder. So wonder or surprise emanates from the poetic imagination or poetic imitation of the writer. And if a writer can add this wonder to his imitation or the things that he imitates in his art, is a romantic poet. Actually, Romanticism has got also philosophic involvement. If we think of Rousseau, or if we think of Immanuel Kant, then we find their contribution to Romantic movement in the last portion of 18th century. Suppose from Immanuel Kant, we get the idea of the awareness of self-consciousness or subjectivity. If we are aware of our self-consciousness, if we can identify our location in the society, it is a romantic quality. Or if we think of Rousseau, who also makes human beings conscious about his location in the society, this very particular philosophy given by Rousseau also contributes to the development of romantic movement. Now we think of William Blake, one of the major poets of 18th century. William Blake's Songs of Innocence was published in 1789, the year of the French Revolution. And many historians believe that this is the beginning of Romantic movement. That is the publication of Blake's Songs of Innocence in 1789 initiated the Romantic movement, because a lot of elements of Romanticism we find in his Songs of Innocence. And Blake was remarkably influenced by three principles of the French Revolution: fraternity, equality, and liberty. And we find these three principles reflected in different manifestations in Blake's poetry. And 4 years after the publication of Songs of Innocence, that is in 1793, his Songs of Experience was published. And this book is also remarkable for self-consciousness. That is, here we find that the characters are very conscious about their locations in the society, and they're also conscious about the corruption, persecution, suppression exercised by different institutions, different authorities of the society. So thus we find the reflection of contemporary philosophers like Immanuel Kant, Rousseau, or many other philosophers. We find the reflections of these philosophers in the writings, especially like William Blake. So after Blake, in 1789, William Wordsworth, in collaboration with Samuel Taylor Coleridge, published Lyrical Ballads, a book of poetry. 23 poems were published here, 19 by William Wordsworth and 4 by S.T. Coleridge. And these poems are undoubtedly groundbreaking because the poems that were structured or constructed in the framework of neoclassical period were totally different from the poems published in Lyrical Ballads. In Lyrical Ballads, we find a spirit of democratization of poetry and poet. Because in the past, the poet was considered to be superhuman beings. The poets were not ordinary people. They were especially gifted people. And the poets were also called prophets by many people of different cultures. Suppose among the Romans, the poets were called pates, that is, they were the messengers from God. And the Greeks called poets poet that is the makers of the world of imagination. But Wordsworth has defined poet in a very democratic way, and he has brought poets in contact with flesh and blood. That is, poets are men talking to, poets are men, that is flesh and blood talking to men. And he has also said that a poet is different from ordinary man only in one respect. And what is that? That is, the poet has got a comprehensive soul that an ordinary man does not have. Now, what is a comprehensive soul? Suppose a flower is a flower to me because I am an ordinary person. But to a poet, a flower may be a symbol of self-sacrifice. It may be a symbol of a lot of things. A flower is more than flower to a poet. He can discover the spirit of the universe, the spirit of God, the spirit of humanity behind the veil of the superficial appearance of the flower that an ordinary man cannot discover. And here lies the difference between an ordinary man and a poet. And Wordsworth has also said that a poet must talk to the ordinary people in the language of the ordinary people. So these assertions of William Wordsworth invite a lot of criticisms from different corners, but the impact that Wordsworth created with his these assertions in his preface to the Lyrical Ballads, which was published in 1802, undoubtedly brought about a revolutionary change in the reader's attitude towards poet and towards poetry. And Wordsworth could conquer the distance between the poet and poetry. The neoclassical poetry was mostly written for the well-educated or highly educated readers. But Romantic poetry, Wordsworth declares, was written for the ordinary people. Though it has got some difficulties for the ordinary people to have an access into Romantic poetry, but the declaration or proclamation that Wordsworth has made undoubtedly brought about a positive impact on the relationship between poetry and the readers. So in this way, Wordsworth invited a lot of people, especially average readers, to poetry. And Wordsworth, through these declarations, could make a group of poets. He could also form a group of poets who followed his track and developed a new genre of poetry or new movement in the history of literature, English literature. In this way, we find that Romanticism is a kind of movement that differentiated English poetry from the scholastic or very pedantic pedagogy of neoclassical poetry. In this way, Romanticism or Romantic movement brought about a remarkable change in the history of English poetry. Besides, another thing about Romantic poetry that we can say that in 1750, industrialization started very widely in England, and Enlightenment also started widely in European society. And while industrialization was going on, people were getting very much mechanized because they had to work all day long in the factory for survival. And they didn't have any scope to think of their own self, think of their own feelings or emotions, intuitions. But Romantic poetry took the readers to the solitude of nature and invited the readers to look at their own emotional self. This is undoubtedly a remarkable or a very significant change in poetry, which was at that time recited and produced by the writers and readers of that time, especially in the second half of 18th century. So suppose Wordsworth's prelude, Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey, invited the readers to go in contact with nature and communicate with the solitude, with the tranquility of nature. And he has also defined poetry in a different way. That is, poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. So Wordsworth invited the readers to explore their emotional entity, not rational, because rationality makes life complicated. Rationality discovers the evils all around us. And if we are anxious of all these evils around us, that may make our life impossible. And we can only have a very comfortable breath when we think of our emotional attachment with the solitude of nature. So Romanticism is a way out of this suffocated industrialization, industrial or mechanized life. So in this way, Romanticism brings about a positive change in literature. Now, one thing that may be confusing to the readers of Romantic poetry is that we may question, can't we call Shakespeare a Romantic poet? Or can't we call Milton a Romantic poet? Or can't we call Andrew Marvell a Romantic poet, or John Dryden a Romantic poet? Yes, a lot of romantic elements we find with all these writers. But the movement of Romanticism that started in the last portion or last half of 18th century through the writings of Thomas Gray or William Blake, Sade, or William Wordsworth, S.T. Coleridge, then Lord Byron, Percy Bysshe Shelley, John Keats. So the movement that started with this bunch of glaring writers, poets of English literature was really an epoch-making initiative that we do not find with the writings of Shakespeare. Shakespeare was romantic, undoubtedly, but he could not create a romantic movement. Or we find many romantic elements in Dryden also, in John Donne also, but they could not initiate a movement that Wordsworth initiated with his publication of Lyrical Ballads, or with his publication of Preface to the Lyrical Ballads. And here lies the difference. And for that reason, we call Wordsworth one of the founders of Romantic movement. And Coleridge was a co-founder of Romantic movement. And Byron, Shelley, Keats contributed immensely to the development of this Romantic movement. So I think my discussion is to be stopped now. And in my next lecture, I will continue my discussion on this particular topic. And I will also explain some poems on the basis of Romantic movement or Romanticism. And I really feel delighted to have you with me, with your support. I like to go on with my lectures. I highly appreciate your support for me, and I wish you all the best, and looking forward to meeting you with my next lecture. So thank you very much.